The valley was still half asleep when the first tremor reached him. Just a faint vibration through the mud, subtle enough that anyone else might have mistaken it for distant artillery. But he knew better. He'd learned to read sounds the way some men read scripture. The steady whine of gears climbing through fog, the irregular clatter of stones kicked by armored tires. A German engine, specifically a 222, closing in. The morning fog hung thick over the Liri Valley, rolling across the ground like wet cotton pulled from an old mattress. Visibility was barely 10 meters. Perfect scouting weather. Perfect killing weather. He pressed himself deeper into the ditch, cheek against the cold earth. Breath held tight in his chest. The mud soaked through his uniform, stealing warmth in a slow, patient way. His pulse thudded so loud he worried the noise might give him away. Across the narrow road, buried under a thin layer of dirt, lay the thing he wasn't supposed to build. 2 standard-issue entrenching shovels driven into the ground at precise angles. Between them, 30 feet of barbed wire pulled so tight it hummed faintly when the wind passed. A trap, no manual authorized, no officer approved, and no soldier with sense would ever admit to creating. But it was there, waiting, silent, invisible. The German scout car emerged before it was visible. The engine's pitch climbed as the vehicle approached, slow and methodical, the way all reconnaissance crews operated at dawn. They weren't expecting resistance. They never did. These morning runs had become predictable. Cruise through the valley, spot American foxholes, report back, and let the artillery finish the job. He wiped mud off his hands and tightened his grip on the rifle. Not because it would help, but because it gave him something to anchor himself. A rifle wouldn't stop a 222. Nothing they had out here would. That's why he'd made the wire. A faint metallic rattle resonated through the fog as the scout car rolled closer. He could almost picture the open-top turret, the gunner lazily sweeping the 20mm cannon across the valley, more from habit than caution. The commander would be half-standing, binoculars raised, trusting speed and armor to protect them. They had no idea. He exhaled slowly to steady his shaking hands. The shovels were buried deeper than they looked. The wire was set at exactly axle height, measured, tested, retested in the dead of night. He wasn't sure it would hold. He wasn't sure it wouldn't snap. But he knew one thing: doing nothing meant watching another friend die. The engine grew louder, tires crunching gravel. The shape of the armored nose finally took form through the fog. Grey steel cutting through white mist like a shark fin breaking water. 15 miles per hour. Just enough speed to kill a man. Just enough speed to flip a vehicle. If the wire worked. He swallowed hard. The moment stretched, suspended on a thin thread of anticipation. Okay, trap built from rust and desperation, waited underneath the fog, and a single question echoed in his mind. How can a piece of wire stop armored steel? Long before Italy, long before the war, he grew up in a town where engines never really stopped. Gary, Indiana, steel heart of the Midwest. The kind of place where the sky glowed orange at night from the mills, and every window rattled when the blast furnaces opened. Kids there didn't learn to fix things for fun. They learned because everything around them was always breaking. He was the middle child in a family that stretched every dollar until the edges frayed. His father worked the furnaces, 12, sometimes 15 hours a shift, coming home with burns on his arms and the smell of iron baked into his clothes. His mother patched uniforms, cooked what she could, and hoped one of the older kids would find work steady enough to help. There weren't many toys in that house, but there were always broken radios, cracked latches, bent tools, and scraps of wire they pulled off junk piles behind the mill. That's where he first learned the one rule his father repeated often. You fix it with what you have. Nobody's bringing you something better. By 14, he could take apart a rusted coupling block with a pocket knife and a hammer. By 15, he spent evenings down by the rail yards, watching men repair switching gear older than they were. Coupler pins slipped, brake cables snapped, steel cars clanged into each other with bone-shaking force. Someone always had to crawl under, patch something with rope or a strip of metal, and pray it held long enough to get the load moving. He learned to see problems before they became disasters. A loose pin in the gravel, a frayed cable vibrating wrong, a hitch leaning 1 inch off center. Tiny things nobody else cared to notice, until they caused a derailment. That's where he picked up the habit of improvisation. If you didn't have the right tool, you made one. If you didn't have time, you used whatever was in reach. If it worked, that was good enough. If it didn't, you tried again. So when the recruiter came through town in 1943 promising training, adventure, and steady pay, it sounded almost too easy. He signed up with the kind of hope only a kid who's never left home can have. But the army he walked into wasn't the one he imagined. 8 weeks of basic that felt rushed, a rifle he barely had time to qualify with, and officers who cared more about checkboxes than preparation. By the time he landed in North Africa and then Italy, he understood the truth. War didn't wait for training manuals, and nothing the army issued could fix the problems waiting for him in the mountains. Improvisation wasn't a skill he brought with him. It was the only thing that kept him alive. Italy was supposed to be the soft underbelly of Europe. That's what the planners said. What he found instead was a country carved into ridges, valleys, rivers, and stone villages that seemed designed to swallow men whole. Mud dragged at boots until each step felt like lifting a sandbag. The cold seeped through every layer of clothing, settling in the bones. And above it all, the distant thump of artillery never stopped. Not for a single hour. The days blurred into a rhythm of exhaustion. Move, dig, wait, freeze, move again. Nights were worse. The valley floors funneled sound upward, so every shell, every scream, every random burst of gunfire echoed like it was happening 3 feet away. Sleep came in thin slices. Rest didn't come at all. But the thing that scared them most wasn't the artillery or the infantry attacks. It was the quiet moments before the sun fully rose or just after it dipped below the hills. That's when the German reconnaissance units hunted. They weren't there for glory or territory. They were there to take notes. The Sonderkraftfahrzeug 222, or simply the 222, was their favorite tool. A light-armored scout car, no bigger than a pickup truck, yet tough enough to shrug off rifle fire, like rain on steel. 4 wheels, sloped armor, a turret-mounted 20 terasilometer autocannon, and an MG-34 coaxial machine gun. Open-topped, so the commander could stand half out, scanning terrain with binoculars while barking orders to the driver. Fast enough to vanish before anyone could react. Armored enough that nothing the Americans carried could stop it. It moved like a ghost across the Italian countryside, appearing suddenly, firing short bursts, then fading into the fog. Every morning and evening, the 222 would sweep the roads and ridgelines, not to kill, but to observe, to mark trenches, foxholes, supply placements, radio operators. And once the Germans had that information, They didn't need to come back. They just let their artillery do the work. Hours later, sometimes half a day, sometimes right after sunset, shells would rain down on the exact spots the Tu-22 had scanned. Precision strikes that tore foxholes apart and buried men alive. Soldiers started to realize they weren't dying in battles or ambushes. They were dying in patterns. The Americans had doctrine for dealing with armored reconnaissance, mines to slow them down, anti-tank rifles to damage the wheels, and bazookas to finish the job. On paper, it all made sense. In Italy, none of it existed. Mines were hoarded for defensive lines. Anti-tank rifles had been phased out and never replaced. Bazookas? Maybe 1 or 2 per company, if they were lucky. His unit had 9 for the entire division. And most squads never saw one up close. So when a 222 appeared at dawn, everyone knew the script. Fire your rifle out of desperation. Watch sparks fly off armor. Wait for it to pass. Pray you weren't on the list that artillery would revisit later. It wasn't a fair fight. It wasn't even a fight. It was a slow bleed, and every man in the valley knew the next sweep could be his turn. The first death came quietly, the way most losses in Italy did, not with a heroic charge or a dramatic stand, but in the pale blue light just before sunrise. His friend Kowalski had taken the early watch, same as usual. A kid from Pittsburgh who joked too loud, laughed too hard, and carried pictures of his younger brothers like they were treasure. One moment he was there, leaning on the rim of his foxhole, squinting into the fog. The next, the familiar growl of a 222 drifted in from the tree line. By the time anyone reacted, the scout car swept past, firing a controlled burst from its MG-34. 3 shots, precise and effortless. When the air cleared, Kowalski was lying still, head turned to the side, as if he'd simply fallen asleep. There was no last word, no dramatic goodbye. Someone just shouted his name, and the silence that followed said everything. The second loss hit even harder. Sergeant Brennan wasn't just another soldier. He was the one who had shown him how to build a foxhole that wouldn't fill with water, how to layer socks to avoid frostbite, how to read the land so you didn't step somewhere stupid. A Brooklyn native, older than most of them, quick with a joke but sharper with advice. He'd survived North Africa, Salerno, and weeks of brutal fighting north of Naples. He died on a muddy slope trying to throw a grenade at a passing scout car. The angle was off by a few feet. The 20mm autocannon wasn't. There wasn't even time to pull him back before the car vanished down the road, leaving only the thud of his body hitting the mud. Losing Brennan felt like losing the only adult in a world full of terrified boys. The third death was Vargas, the guy who always saved an extra cigarette, even when there were only 3 left in the entire squad. Soft-spoken from El Paso, half his English learned from the same men he fought beside. At dusk, a scout car cut straight through their line, spraying bullets in a wide arc. Vargas tried to move. The shot caught him before he made it 2 steps. They tried to stop the bleeding, but the wound was too deep, too fast. That night, he sat by the dying fire, staring at the mud where Vargas had fallen. 3 men, 3 different places, 3 different moments. But one thing was the same every time. The same road, the same timing, the same vehicle. The 222s were following a pattern so clear it might as well have been printed on the valley floor. Dawn, dusk, same routes, same speed. Always fast enough to escape, always armored enough to ignore rifle fire. Fear had been the normal reaction at first. fear of being seen, fear of being the next body dragged from the mud. But now, something else took root. Not fear, not dread, anger. A quiet, steady anger that settled in his chest and refused to budge. Because these weren't random deaths, they were preventable ones. And someone had to stop the pattern before it swallowed the rest of them. The meeting was held in what was left of an old barn. Half a roof, 3 standing walls, and the faint smell of wet hay buried somewhere beneath months of smoke and gunpowder. 20 exhausted soldiers gathered inside, boots caked with mud, faces hollow from too many sleepless nights. Their rifles leaned against broken beams, mud dripping onto the floor. Captain Morrison stood under a shattered rafter, holding a clipboard that looked far too clean for a place like this. He cleared his throat, the sound oddly sharp in the cold air, and began reading straight from the field manual. Maintain defensive posture, conserve anti-vehicle assets, await resupply. No unauthorized obstacles, no improvised devices, no deviation from approved doctrine. The men barely reacted. They'd heard every version of that speech. It always meant the same thing. You're on your own, but don't try anything creative. Another scout car had passed through their sector just hours earlier, firing into empty foxholes as if mocking them. 2 more soldiers were dead, yet here they were, listening to rules written by people who hadn't seen mud, artillery, or a 222 up close. Morrison continued reading, voice steady, eyes never lifting from the page. Until new shipments arrive, follow established engagement protocols. Someone near the back exhaled sharply. Not a complaint, more like resignation. He stood with his arms crossed, back pressed to the barn wall. He wasn't the outspoken type. He wasn't a troublemaker. But the words struck him like static building under the skin. He raised a hand slightly. "Sir," he said, tone respectful. "What if we rigged wire across the roads, low height, taut enough to catch the axles?" The captain finally looked up. It wasn't anger in his expression. It was disbelief, the kind officers reserved for ideas that didn't fit inside the manual. "Corporal," Morrison said, keeping his voice level, "the field manual is explicit. Wire entanglements are defensive obstacles. They require engineering support, specific placement, and approval. They are not..." He hesitated, choosing the safest wording. "Random traps." "But sir," the answer is no. No raised voices, no argument. Just a door quietly closing on the only idea that made sense. The rest of the room stayed silent. Nobody backed him up, but nobody disagreed either. They just stared at the floorboards, knowing they'd walk back into the valley tomorrow with nothing but rifles against armored steel. He didn't push it, didn't try again. He simply nodded, stepped away from the wall, and walked out into the fading light. The cold hit him immediately, sharper than before. He didn't need a dramatic confrontation. He didn't need permission. He just needed the darkness, a coil of wire, 2 shovels, and the decision that had already formed inside him. The camp settled into an uneasy quiet after midnight, the kind of silence that didn't mean safety, only that both armies were too tired to keep killing each other. Thin clouds drifted across the moon, casting shifting shadows over the valley. Most of the men were asleep in shallow foxholes, curled around their rifles for warmth. He wasn't sleeping. He waited until the captain finished his rounds, until the last whispers died out, until the distant guns fell into a steady, predictable rhythm. Then he slipped from his hole, moving low and quiet, boots sinking into the wet earth. In his hands, 2 entrenching shovels, their handles already rough with dried mud. Over his shoulder, a coil of barbed wire he'd taken from the supply dump, rust flaking off under his grip. Each step felt heavier than the last. He wasn't just sneaking out. He was crossing a line the army had drawn in thick, permanent ink. Unauthorized obstacles, improvised devices, violation of doctrine. The kind of thing that earned men punishment even in peacetime, let alone this. But orders didn't bury friends. Scout cars did. The path to the road cut between two ridges, the mud grabbing his boots with a wet, sucking sound. He flinched every time it pulled too hard, half expecting the noise to carry up to a German listening post. He moved slower after that, placing each step like it might detonate something unseen. The road itself was a narrow strip of churned dirt, the same one the 202s loved to use. He'd been watching them for weeks, counting the seconds they spent in each bend, memorizing where they slowed, where they sped up. He knew this stretch better than some of the officers who gave him orders. A few days earlier, he'd studied the wreck of a disabled 222 from another sector, measured the axle height with his hand, felt the clearance under the frame, traced the grooves worn into the wheel housing. It all came back to him now as he knelt in the mud. 14 inches. That was the sweet spot, low enough to catch the axle, high enough not to snap on impact. He drove the first shovel into the left side of the road, using a rock to hammer it deep until it stopped moving. Then the second on the right, 18 feet apart, same angle, same depth. His palms burned as he tightened the wire around each handle. The barbs tore his skin, drawing thin lines of blood that mixed instantly with mud. He didn't stop, didn't wince. Every rustle in the brush felt like footsteps. Every shift of wind sounded like the soft clink of a German rifle sling. Once, the distant rumble of artillery rolled over the hills and made him drop flat against the ground, heart slamming. But no patrol came. He stretched the wire across the road, pulling until it vibrated in the cold air. Not too tight, not too loose. He tested it with the back of his knuckles. It hummed, just barely. Perfect. He buried it under a thin layer of wet earth, just enough to hide it from casual eyes. The shovels leaned like forgotten tools, half covered in mud, nothing to draw attention unless someone stared too long. When it was done, he crouched there for a moment, breathing hard, hands shaking from adrenaline and cold. He wasn't sure if the trap would work. He wasn't sure if it would hold. But he knew one thing: doing nothing was no longer an option. He wiped the mud from his jacket, picked up his rifle, and slipped back toward the American lines. By the time he reached his foxhole, the sky was beginning to gray. His uniform was soaked, his hands were bleeding, and his body felt like it had been carrying granite blocks. But for the first time in weeks, he felt something close to determination. He'd set the wire. Now he had to wait for dawn. The fog that morning was different, thicker, denser. It clung to the valley like smoke after a bombardment, swallowing the trees, the road, even the outline of the hills. Men moved like shadows in it, half awake, stepping carefully so they didn't lose their footing. The cold bit through uniforms, stiffening fingers and slowing breath. He was already awake. He hadn't slept more than a few minutes after setting the wire. His heart had never settled. Every hour or so, he'd lift his head, listening, waiting, wondering if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life, or the most necessary one. Then, just as the sky began to pale, he heard it. Not loud, not sharp, just a low, distant vibration that didn't belong to the valley. A mechanical hum buried inside the fog, "It 222. He didn't sit up all the way. He didn't shout. He just froze, eyes narrowing toward the road, listening as the sound grew clearer. Years of rail yard work had taught him the language of machines. The grinding ascent of gears, the familiar pitch of stressed engines. This one was coming from the north, right on schedule. He tapped the shoulder of the man next to him and whispered, "Vehicle." The soldier blinked awake, confused. "Artillery?" "No, scout car." That was enough. Word spread quietly in the trench line, men shifting into cover, rifles raised out of instinct, even though they knew they were useless. Someone cursed under his breath. Someone else crossed himself. He wiped the mud from his eyes and peered into the fog. 700 yards. The engine's hum reached a steady rhythm, confident, unhurried. The car was moving exactly the way reconnaissance vehicles always did at dawn. 500 yards. He could hear the rocks crunching under the tires now, a distinct, irregular clatter. The turret rotated once, a lazy sweep, barely cautious. 300 yards. A shadow emerged, then steel, then the angular nose of the scout car, pushing through the fog like a shark cutting through water. The commander stood half out of the hatch, binoculars pressed to his face, oblivious to everything waiting in the mud beneath him. His hands trembled as he pressed against the dirt. Not from fear, from anticipation. 50 yards. The vehicle picked up speed. Then, the moment hit. The front wheel struck the wire at full force. The effect was instant and violent. The axle jerked sideways with a metallic crack, and the entire vehicle lurched forward like it had been punched by something enormous. The right wheel locked. The left kept moving. Momentum did the rest. The 222 flipped once, twice, a third time. Steel screamed as it scraped across the road. Mud exploded into the air, spraying across the valley like dark rain. The turret slammed into the ground, bending metal and throwing sparks. The open hatch flung the commander out mid-roll, his body tumbling across the earth until it landed in a broken heap. When the vehicle finally stopped, it lay upside down, wheels spinning uselessly in the air, engine howling in mechanical agony. Nobody moved at first. The valley went silent. Every soldier, every bird, even the distant artillery, as if stunned by what they'd just witnessed. Then he ran, not toward safety, not back toward the American line, straight toward the wreck. Bullets weren't flying, but they could start any second. An overturned scout car was a beacon. German infantry could appear from the tree line at any moment. But he didn't think about that. He only thought about the man inside. Smoke leaked from the engine compartment. Fuel dripped onto the ground. The driver was hanging halfway out of the shattered windscreen, dazed, blood running down his face. The German lifted a weak hand toward him, eyes wide with fear. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the man under the arms and dragged him clear of the burning vehicle, hauling him to the ditch before rolling him onto his side so he could breathe. The soldier mumbled something in German, gratitude maybe, before passing out. Shouts echoed behind him. American voices, officers running, boots pounding the mud. He turned back to the wreck. The wire was still wrapped around the front axle, stretched tight, glinting with mud and blood. If the captain saw it, if anyone saw it, the questions would start. The consequences would follow. He rushed to the axle, tore the wire free, coiled it with shaking hands, and shoved it deep into his pack. He tugged the shovels loose, dragging them 20 feet away and burying them beneath loose dirt. By the time the officers arrived, the scout car looked like it had simply failed. A freak accident, a twist of fate. not a trap set by a desperate soldier. He stepped back into line, chest heaving, mud on his face, hands bleeding. Nobody knew what he'd done. But in that silent, fog-soaked valley, he realized something. For the first time in weeks, the 222 hadn't won. News traveled fast in a place where nothing ever changed. By noon, the entire company had heard a version of the story. A 222 had flipped on the Cassino road, tumbled end over end, and landed upside down like a beetle on its back. Some said it hit a mine. Others claimed the driver panicked. One man swore the axle simply snapped in half, like the vehicle had been cursed. But one phrase kept repeating, carried from foxhole to foxhole in low, cautious voices. "Scout cars don't flip like that." He stayed quiet, sat in the mud, cleaning his rifle like it was any other morning, even though his hands still burned from where the barbs had cut him. He didn't volunteer details, didn't offer explanations. But secrets don't stay buried long in a unit that sleeps shoulder to shoulder. Late in the afternoon, his friend Morrison, the younger one, not the captain, walked up and dropped onto the dirt beside him. He didn't say anything at first, just watched him for a moment, eyes narrowed, jaw working like he was chewing on something unsaid. Then softly, "Jimmy, I saw the wire in your back." He froze. Morrison didn't look angry. He looked curious, impressed even. "I know what barbed wire looks like, and I know you didn't grab it for decoration." He didn't answer, didn't deny it, didn't confirm it. Morrison leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Did you make that happen this morning?" A long pause. Then Jimmy whispered, "You didn't see anything?" Morrison nodded once. "Fine. Then just teach me how to set one." And that was how it began. Not with orders, not with approval, but with a quiet request between two exhausted soldiers who were tired of watching their friends die. That night, they walked out together to a different stretch of road. Morrison carried the shovels. Jimmy carried the wire. They worked in silence. Jimmy showed him the angles, the tension, the exact height needed. No speeches, no promises, just technique. The next night, someone else asked Morrison for help. Then another. Soon no one was teaching officially, but everyone was learning anyway. The traps spread like a rumor you could step on. 2 here, 3 farther down the valley, another near the river bend. Nobody wrote anything down. Nobody reported anything up the chain. The wire traps simply appeared wherever tired, angry men had access to shovels and 30 feet of determination. It didn't take long for the Germans to notice something was wrong. Scout cars started approaching roads more slowly. Commanders dismounted and walked ahead on foot, scanning the ground with nervous glances. Engines idled instead of roaring. Routes changed. Speeds dropped. Whole sectors went quiet for days at a time. Reconnaissance effectiveness plunged. Artillery strikes fell by more than half. For the first time in weeks, soldiers actually slept. And up the chain of command, officers noticed the results. Fewer dead, fewer. Reports of morning attacks, fewer bodies being carried back after dusk. But nobody asked questions. Nobody demanded explanations. Nobody wanted to know why the numbers suddenly changed. Because the unofficial truth was safer not knowing. And because somewhere in that valley, the war had shifted. Not with a new weapon, not with a fancy doctrine, but with whispers and a line of wire pulled tight across a muddy road. By late April, the patterns in the valley were impossible to ignore. German reconnaissance had slowed to a crawl. Artillery strikes fell off a cliff. Morning patrols grew quieter, safer. The numbers didn't lie, and higher command finally took notice. A team from division headquarters arrived one afternoon. Clipboards, binoculars, polished boots that instantly collected mud. They walked the ridgelines, inspected trenches, studied the roads soldiers had fought and bled over for months. They saw the wire still half buried in mud, saw the angled shovels, saw the positions where vehicles had skidded off or overturned. They didn't congratulate anyone. They didn't accuse anyone. They simply made notes, looked at each other and walked on. No approval, no ban, just silence. It was the safest answer the army could offer. If the method worked, they benefited. If anything went wrong, nobody had ever authorized it. Pragmatism disguised as ignorance. For the men on the front line, that was enough. When the company rotated out of the valley for rest near Naples, he was quietly called to a canvas tent behind division headquarters. A major he'd never met sat at a folding desk, flipping through reports that didn't mention his name once. "I'm not here to reprimand you," the major said without looking up. "But I need you to teach others what you've been doing, unofficially." And so he did. For 2 weeks, he walked soldiers through the technique. Axle height, shovel angles, wire tension, concealment, removal. No paperwork, no signatures, just whispered instruction passed from tired hands to willing ones. By July, units from 2 more divisions were using the method. By August, it had spread across the Italian front like a quiet rumor with teeth. After the war, engineers studying reconnaissance losses during the Italian campaign eventually confirmed the physics behind it. Wire obstacles at axle height were effective for disabling light armored vehicles. In 1949, the tactic appeared in revised training manuals under the dry name Axle Height Wire Obstacles. No author listed, no citation given, no mention of a corporal in the mud who'd figured it out long before anyone in an office did. He went home in late 45, returned to the same rail yards he'd known as a teenager, married, raised kids, worked the switches, fixed couplers and cables, never talked much about Italy. If anyone asked, he'd just shrug and say he did his job. But the truth was quieter and heavier. Hundreds of soldiers lived because he'd refused to obey a rule that wasn't saving anyone. History didn't print his name, no medals, no documentaries, no footnotes. Just a line of wire in a forgotten valley, and the kind of innovation that only comes from desperation, courage, and a man who couldn't watch another friend die.